Okay, so next book asked you to vote. And when the votes were in, it was quite a clear winner, which was Hacker by Malorie Blackman, which isn't a book I've read before, but I've read quite a bit of Malorie Blackman myself before, as I know some of you have. She's a great author, so hopefully this will be enjoyable. Chapter 1, The Start of the Bad Times. Maths exams. Ugh. It was a toast-warm Friday afternoon in May, the kind of afternoon when all you wanted to do was sunbathe and fan yourself. But end-of-year exams had come around again, and all of us Borough Vale Year 9s had a maths exam ahead of us. I was near the front of the queue to get into the exam room, and my brother Gib and his friend Chauncey were only a few behind me. I was pretending to talk to my friend Maggie, but really I was earwigging on Gib and Chauncey's conversation. I should be lying down in a garden with a ginormous chocolate milkshake and a whole packet of chocolate digestives all to myself, Gib said. Typical you. Pig. I thought, I know what you mean, Chauncey said. Chauncey sighed. I think I'd rather be at the dentist, having all my teeth filled, than having to spend the afternoon trying to answer unanswerable maths questions. Well, I'd rather be in a leaky canoe in a crocodile-infested river, Gibbs said. Chauncey laughed. I'd rather be naked at the North Pole. Amateur, Gibbs scoffed. I'd rather be kissed by Vicky. No, on second thoughts, no I wouldn't. I spun around. If I kissed you, brat face, my lips would probably drop off. Were real brothers as rotten as Gib always was to me? I wondered. He was only my brother because his mum and dad had adopted me when I was a baby. Then they were unlucky enough to have him. It would have been so lovely to have been an only child. I wasn't talking to you, Vicky. Don't stick this. Gib tapped his nose with his finger where it isn't wanted. I glared at him and Chauncey. Chauncey was grinning at me, enjoying Gib's put down. Chauncey, or Alexandra Chaucer, as it is said on a school register, wasn't as bad as Gib, but he was sure heading that way. He was at least half a head taller than Gib, but he followed my scabby brother around everywhere, like a sheep or a puppy dog. Chauncey was pretty average, except for his hair. It seemed to alternate between a speckled chocolate brown and a dusty black, depending on how the light hit it. It made him look as if his hair was permanently full of dandruff. What I didn't like about Chauncey was that he was always laughing at me. I stuck my tongue out at both of them and turned back to my friend Maggie. I wished I was the sort of person who could think of really funny, razor-sharp comebacks on the spur of the moment, but I never could. I always came up with something very clever and funny to say about 2 days after the event. Gib's good at thinking on his feet, though. He has an answer for everything. Never mind them, Maggie said softly. They're just juvenile. That was her current favourite word. Maggie read the dictionary the way I read the Harry Potter books. Each week she'd pick out a new word, and then she'd bore us all silly by trying to use it in practically every other sentence. Did you revise, Vicky? She asked. Not really, I shrugged. Did you? Maggie shook her head. No, I tried to, but no. I smiled at Maggie. I reckon she'd probably been up most nights in the past week, revising hard, just like I'd done. Why do we never own up to revising? I wondered. But I guess I know why, really. No one wanted to fail their exams, but at the same time, who wanted to be an egghead or a boffin? And worse still, what if you did say you'd revised hard and then you failed? Shame. Just then the assembly hall doors opened. Mrs. Bracken stood in the doorway, peering at us through her glasses, which were thicker than double glazing. They were even thicker than my glasses, and that's saying something. Less noise, please, she said at the top of her lungs. You may all come in now. As soon as I walked into the hall, I wrinkled up my nose at the cheesy smell of feet and old shoes. There'd obviously been a PE lesson in the hall that morning, and I grabbed a desk right in the middle of the hall and sat down. The sounds of chairs being dragged across the wooden floor, the clatter of pens and pencils in polythene bags and pencil cases, worried whispers and subdued coughs filled the air. At last, even though those noises died away, even those noises died away as everyone settled down in their seats. I had to shuffle for a good minute before I got comfortable, as I was going to get. The chair seats were hard as rock. Right then, who needs a school calculator? Mrs. Bracken called out. A forest of arms appeared and waved in the air. Mrs. Bracken and Mr. Peterson walked around the hall, each carrying a large cardboard box from which they distributed the calculators. I didn't need one. I had my own calculator, which Dad and Mum had bought me for Christmas. After the calculators were given out, Mrs. Bracken walked up onto the stage and slowly scanned the hall with her beady eyes. Mr. Peterson was still walking up and down, and Mrs. Cannon, my geography teacher, sat in a chair at the side of the hall, reading through the maths paper. Mrs. Bracken turned her attention to the huge clock on the wall, so we all did too. Its slow echoed in the hall as every second was marked up to 2 o'clock. You may begin, she said at last. Instantly the hall was alive with the rustle of papers. This term, the maths exam covered trigonometry and polygons. I flicked through the exam. Boring, but not too bad. I looked around to see what Gib was doing. I caught sight of him almost immediately. He was staring down at the first page of the 5-page exam. Then he turned to the next page, then the next, and the next. As I watched, he flicked through the exam paper again, hoping no doubt that with a second reading the questions would change. They didn't. He slumped in his chair and rested his shiny, perspiring forehead onto his hand. He knew, and I knew, that he was in really deep trouble. I couldn't resist a bit of a smirk. Really mean, I know, but he deserved it for being such a pig. I took a quick glance around the hall. Shivy, the egghead, was stuffing 3 peppermints into her mouth at once. She'd probably come out of the hall at the end boasting about how easy the exam had been. She's a real swat and a half, that one. There was Tristan in his new navy blue jacket, which he refused to take off for anyone. I was sure he'd even slept in it. Then, as I watched, Tristan pushed up his jacket sleeve to read what he had written on his shirt cuff. I couldn't believe it. If I was going to fail, at least I was going to do it under my own steam. I directed the filthiest look I could at him, then turned away in disgust, hoping that he'd see me. But everyone was at it. My friend Maggie had her nose buried inside her pencil case, and I could see writing on the inside of the case, even from where I was sitting. I was so shocked. I could understand Tristan cheating, but he couldn't write his name without looking on his shirt sleeve first. But Maggie, I felt a sudden strange prickling all over my skin. I looked up, and there was Crackly Bracken watching me. Hastily, I looked down at my paper and picked up my pen. I didn't want her to think I was cheating. I studied the first question. The trouble was that I could learn the basic rules, but I had some trouble applying them if I didn't think about it first, for ages. After a good 5 minutes, thinking how I should do question 1, I picked up my calculator. That's when I had my mega brilliant idea. I looked from the exam paper to my calculator and back again. I'm okay at maths, but computing is my subject. If that's not boasting, to be fair, I think it is. And my calculator was programmable. It looked like an ordinary calculator, except the display was a little bigger, and I'd written programs on it lots of times before. So why not just write a program to work out interior and exterior angles and lengths and areas and all that other stuff? I had all the necessary functions on my calculator. I could program it without even having to think about it much. Feeling very pleased with myself, I took a piece of paper and started to work out how I should write my program. After that, I typed it into my calculator. All in all, it took about 20 minutes. Then I whizzed through the maths questions in about 2 minutes flat, just to make sure that I hadn't got my program wrong. I worked out the first, 10th and last questions by hand on a square piece of paper. My answers were the same as the calculators, so I knew I had got them right. I wanted to jump up and down on my chair. I was so chuffed. I put my pen down and leaned back, arms folded. I glanced up at the hall clock. It was only 2:30. I'd finished my test in half an hour. I couldn't help it. I started grinning. Victoria Gibson, get on with the test. Mrs. Bracken's voice boomed out, making me jump. I looked up at her and smiled. I've finished, miss, I said. Instantly, I could feel every eye in the hall upon me. It felt really good. My grin broadened. I could almost feel my head growing bigger too. What did you say? Mrs. Bracken asked. I've finished the exam, miss, I repeated. Mrs. Bracken stood up abruptly, the legs of her chair scraping against the wooden floor of the stage. As she marched down the steps, butterflies appeared from nowhere and started to flutter in my stomach. She made straight for me and snatched up my paper. Her eyes narrowed as she scrutinised each and every page. For the first time, I thought about exactly what I'd done. This was supposed to be a maths exam, not a computing exam. Maybe I shouldn't have used my calculator to get the answers. Slowly, I slid my calculator over the piece of paper I used to work out the design of my program. Then I casually covered my calculator with my hand. I told you I was finished, I said. I only said that so Mrs. Bracken would look at me and not what my hand was doing. Mrs. Bracken straightened up to scowl at me, and the butterflies in my stomach turned into stampeding rhinos. So it was you, was it? Pick up your things, Victoria, and follow me. Mrs. Bracken had a face like thunder. What's the matter? I whispered. Do as you're told, she hissed at me. I scrambled to pick up all the items on my desk. Something told me I was in mega trouble. I stood up. Is there anyone else who claims to have finished? Mrs. Bracken asked. Her piercing gaze darted over everyone else in the assembly hall. I looked around. As soon as I caught anyone's eye, they looked away or down at their chairs, down at their desk. I saw Gib. He had sunk into his chair, trying to look as small as possible as Mrs. Bracken and I looked at him. My head, my entire body, now felt about the size of a pea, and you could have cooked several eggs on my face. No bother at all. Follow me, Mrs. Bracken ordered. Clutching my papers and sweets and my calculator to me, desperate not to drop them, I followed Mrs. Bracken out of the assembly hall. I still didn't understand what was wrong. Maybe she knew about my calculator being programmable. Mrs. Bracken shut the door firmly behind me. And where did you get the answers from? She asked me stonily, as if we didn't know. I stared up at her, thinking I must have misheard. Pardon? I stammered. You heard me. Don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about. You and I both know how every one of your answers happens to be correct. I didn't even feel good when I heard her say that. I knew I was in serious trouble again. Miss, I don't understand, I began. Victoria, there is no way you could have finished this test in... Mrs. Bracken glanced down at her watch. In 33 minutes, unless you already knew the answers. But I didn't. How could... Don't compound your crime by lying, child. But I'm not. So you just read the questions and automatically knew the answers? Mrs. Bracken's eyebrows were so low that they touched her eyelashes. No, not exactly. You didn't show how you worked out any of your answers. There are no jottings on your answer paper, no workings, nothing. Or you are telling me that you worked out the answers to all of my questions in your head. Not exactly, I said. You used my calculator. Don't lie, child. I really did. Mrs. Bracken didn't let me finish. Not another word. You're a cheat, Victoria Gibson, she said furiously. That word made me jump. I wasn't a cheat. I'd never cheated at anything in my life. Mrs. Bracken, if you just let me explain, I began again. I rummaged all through my stuff in my arms to dig out my calculator. I didn't cheat. You don't have to explain, Victoria. I know exactly how you did it. I knew I'd catch the culprit. But I must say I'm surprised it's you. I thought you knew better. Culprit? What culprit? What was she talking about? Mrs. Bracken folded her hands across her ample chest. We are going to see the headmistress, she said with satisfaction. At that, my heart tried to burst out of my chest. My face was burning, boiling hot, and I felt absolutely sick. We're going to see Mrs. Hiff. The words came out as a dismayed squeak. Yes, Mrs. Hiff, Mrs. Bracken said with relish. But I didn't cheat, miss. Of course you did, Mrs. Bracken said icily. When it comes to maths, Victoria, you are no Einstein, and not even Einstein could have finished my test in a short amount of time it took you, unless he had previously had the answers, of course. Previously had the answers? I felt like I'd started watching telly halfway through a really confusing film. How could I have previously had the answers? I programmed my calculator to work out the answers. My eyes were really stinging now, and there was a whole football stuck in my throat, choking me. I'm surprised at you, Victoria. I really am. But I'll tell you something. When I've finished with you, Mrs. Bracken bent over suddenly, so that her face was only centimetres away from mine, and her breath felt horribly warm and moist on my face. When I've finished with you, my girl, you'll wish you'd never done it. Now, follow me. That's the end of chapter 1. See you tomorrow.